And we're back. Last week was delightful. I took a week off to hang out with my family and out-of-town family and everything. We had magical Black Hills family fun days, and it was great. And also, I really miss doing this, so it's nice to be sitting back here at this microphone where I'm now going to tell you a story about a thing that happened. My wife and I took a road trip with a couple of friends several years ago with the first car that I ever saved up money and bought. It was a Saturn SL1. And those things were advertised as having dent-resistant panels, so I think that emboldened me to take it on a road trip all the way down the Baja Peninsula to, Sammy Hagar, the town all the way at the bottom end, Cabo San Lucas. We took a trip all the way down to Cabo San Lucas in this car, and then we put the car on a boat and floated it across the Sea of Cortez. Well, I mean, I didn't float it. The person captaining the boat, the ferry did, but we got to the other side and we drove around Mexico. It was just an amazing trip. The vehicle was never the same. And among the many interesting, fun memories that I have from that, one of my favorite is somewhere on the Baja, we pulled off the road into this little town on the Pacific side, and we were met by a police blockade, just a police stop in the middle of the road. They were stopping everybody. And the guys came up to the car, and Camilla was driving, and they're like, hey, we're doing a fundraiser for the local police here. How much would you like to donate? And my wife was like, oh, we're on a budget. No thanks. We won't donate today. And I was already reaching for money. Like, it's not really optional. They're making it sound optional, sweetie, but it's not optional. And they're like, you sure you wouldn't want to donate anything? And she's like, no, not today. Good luck, though. Thank you. And then she just drove into the town. And we went and we got tacos. And the whole time I'm like, we should leave. We really should leave right now and buy a different road if there is one available. And ultimately, I don't remember anything weird coming to pass, but that was a bribe. You were supposed to pay it. It was presented as optional, but is kind of not optional. And it would appear that there was a cultural deal that was working like that in the time of Jesus in the 1st century AD that we encounter out of context in Matthew chapter 17. There's this weird little anecdote that we get at the end of this chapter, a chapter that starts with the transfiguration and thinking about what the transfiguration meant, and then coming off the mountain from the transcendent and encountering the crass and the mundane. And then again, Jesus explains to the disciples that he's going to get killed and raised back to the life, and the disciples are all super sad. And then boom, you get this thing at the end that really does feel a little bit disconnected. We're back in Capernaum at the beginning of this passage. So this is the hometown where Jesus has done all of his work so far. Looks like he has been couching it up at Peter's place there in Capernaum. So we've got a geography change we're going to need to account for here in just a minute, but that's where the story picks up, is in Capernaum. So verse 24, here we go. After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and asked, doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax? Yeah, he does, he replied. When Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. What do you think, Simon, he asked. From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own sons or from others? From others, Peter answered. Then the sons are exempt, Jesus said to him. But, so that we might not offend them, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you'll find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to him for my tax and yours. The text has us rolling back into Capernaum here, and if you've been hanging out with me for the last few weeks, you know that the text has had us far away from Capernaum for quite a while. There's been these foyers into the far north to get away from all of the chaos, and every time the narrative has Jesus back in highly Jewish territory, there's some kind of conflict or issue that happens about the Sabbath or hand washing or when to perform miracles or who knows what. And this is escalating to such a point that the religious leaders, the Jewish religious leaders, are pretty obviously cooking up bad things for Jesus. But it's also very obvious simultaneously at this point in the narrative that the disciples are not ready. So chapters 16 and 17 really point out this time crunch where the walls are kind of closing in on Jesus, but the disciples aren't really ready for prime time yet. And so Jesus has been throwing energy at them. This the transfiguration, the road trip up north where the confession of Jesus being the Messiah, Christ, the Son of God, all of that stuff happens. So now we come back down to Capernaum, which means the hackles are up because every time we move away from Capernaum, things ease up a little bit. You can stretch out, and every time we come back to Capernaum, they get a little bit worse. Look, I know that there are people who are listening to this right now who are from Lander, Wyoming, and who are from the church that I was a part of for a long time there. I do not mean this as a slight toward you. It's the reality of the work. But even for me, someone who is decidedly not the Messiah or the Son of God, I worked at a church in a small town, 7,000 people in western Wyoming. And it was tough. If I was in town, I was at work. There was stuff to do. I cared about what I was doing. I cared about the town. I cared about the people. And some of the stuff that came up was pretty burdensome. So if I wanted to think about other things or feel that burden lifted, I needed to go to a different zip code, and I would drive away. And I would feel really good. And then I would come back, and as I got closer to Lander, I would feel that weight heavier and heavier on my shoulders as I got closer. And every time I came back, I was simultaneously happy to be back in my town and be back around people I know and love and care about, but also very, very burdened by just all that was awaiting me there. This narrative keeps working the same way. Further away from Capernaum, stuff is easier. Closer to Capernaum, stuff is harder. Well, let's see. Do we run into any difficulty? So Jesus comes back after this vacation, and it's great. And oh yeah, there are some tax collectors waiting right there to pester him. It's like they've been sitting around waiting for the opportunity to ask this very pressing, very important question about the temple tax and whether you actually pay it or not. So we've just been hanging out here. We figured you'd probably come back eventually. Now that you're here, we're not going to really even let you get settled. We need to address this right away. It's very, very important. So after Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" Okay. Obvious question number 1. Are these guys being passive-aggressive by talking to Peter instead of Jesus? Because that's how I read it, at least with my 21st century eyes. I come to this passage, I'm like, I hate it even more that you couldn't just talk to Jesus, that you couldn't just walk up to him and be like, hey, our question is for you, so we're going to ask you. All of that tension and friction acknowledged, there's one other cool geographical note here that I want to throw out, and that is that we know pretty much exactly where this conversation happened. It's possible that the place that has been identified since the earliest of Christian times as the home of Peter and the place where Jesus lived and hung out, it's possible that isn't it, but man, people would have had to have been wrong about it from the very, very beginning. And given the smallness of the town and the significance of the events that happened there with Peter and Jesus, I don't think they would have got this wrong. So assuming that this is one of those places where the tradition surrounding the location is pretty reliable, we know exactly where this conversation happened. You could probably figure out within hearing distance, within a few feet, where this conversation happened with Peter outside of his house in Capernaum, which I think matters even more when you're talking about an event that includes something so seemingly mythical and legendary and miraculous. You got this juxtaposition here of something that is absolutely real people, real place, real time. If you went and you stood there at the right time and you were just waiting around, you would hear this conversation happen. I think this is a worthwhile little rabbit trail and side note because it's one of those interesting Bible juxtapositions where right alongside this very mythical, almost legendary feeling, miraculous account of what's going to happen with this fish and this coin, you have this very grounded, real people, real time, real place. I know right where this happened. I could just go stand there and overhear the conversation if I wanted to use a time travel token on it. These two things happen in such close proximity in the text. And, well, that's one of the odd things about encountering these stories of Jesus, is it's all situated right smack in the middle of incredibly well-documented places and people and events. And yet also it looks like there's this remarkable thin spot between the supernatural and the natural that's being held out here. And that friction, that tension is probably a huge amount of what you and I are wrestling through as we work through a text like this. Whatever the case, I thought it was interesting. Before we run off and get into the temple tax thing, there's a social dynamic here that I want to talk about as well, though. So Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum. Then the collectors of the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" "Yeah, he does," he replied. "Well, why wouldn't you just go talk to Jesus?" Doesn't that seem incredibly petty? I don't know, maybe I'm being sensitive. Maybe it doesn't seem petty to you. So I came into this text with my set of presuppositions, and I encountered that and was like, what the heck? And I was talking with somebody about it, and they're like, I don't know, I read something one time. You might want to go look into this. That was actually considered culturally polite at that point because Jesus, even though he was a very long-term guest of Peter's house, was still a guest at Peter's house. And so I did a little bit of homework on that. And it looks like, though it's a bit difficult to ultimately substantiate, some credible people argue that this was actually a gesture of respect. So if that is the case, then this is one of those places where I am humbled by the reality behind the text and reminded that I don't know all the things. And I'm reminded that both when dealing with people from the far distant past and from now, it is a good idea to give people the benefit of the doubt on motives, and I do not always do that as well as I could. Wow, we are quite a ways into this already, and I haven't even talked about the temple tax thing. Okay. Well, for today, I'll just put a bow on it this way then. The whole reason I told you that story back at the beginning about my wife and this whole optional thing is because it looks like this temple tax issue is sort of a suggestion. We're going to see as we look at it tomorrow that it was established in the Old Testament as something that it looks like you pay once in a lifetime, but the cultural expectation at this point was you probably ought to pay it every year. So do you have to? And what happens if you don't? Is there some kind of consequence if you don't go along with this suggested extra payment of temple tax? And how does a temple levy a tax anyway? At any rate, we'll see what we can do about connecting the dots on that stuff more mañana. I appreciate you hanging out with a previous version of me last week, working through the stuff that happened between the Testaments. And I appreciate and never take for granted that you are here in real time hanging out with me now. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.